Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the neighbor who destroyed my fence. I thought my life was average, if not uneventful, until I had one of the strangest and most frustrating neighbor conflicts ever. I've lived on this property for 5 years, and everything was fine until recently. I spent a lot of time and money building a large wooden fence around my home when I moved in. I'm protective of my space, so a fence gave me peace of mind and kept my active dog from wandering too close to the street. I loved the fence from the start, functional, attractive, and tall enough for privacy. I installed a few security cameras around my property because my job requires me to travel, and I needed to feel secure knowing I could remotely check on my place. The system was simple but covered the front yard, driveway, and part of the street. I had no idea these cameras would record something so bizarre that it still baffles me. Getting ahead of myself, beginning with Sterling, my neighbor. Before I describe the chaotic events that led to surprising consequences for him, let me describe how we lived together. The neighborhood welcomed Sterling 4 months ago. He seemed quiet and withdrawn at first, but I noticed he started renovating his new place quickly. The neighborhood heard he bought the property cheaply to flip or rent it. Though small, his property had a large backyard that overlooked part of a small wooded area behind our street. My tall wooden fence divides our lots on one side. Sterling avoided conversation for the first few weeks. He was probably remodeling the interior. We passed occasionally. He waved politely from his driveway and I nodded hello. That was our only contact. It didn't bother me because not everyone is social. Respect people's boundaries. Sterling began exploring his backyard more in the 3rd week after moving in. He spent days trimming hedges, clearing brush, and hacking at thick weeds in the overgrown yard. It seemed laborious. I assumed he wanted a nice outdoor space. Truthfully, I was glad to see an overgrown yard transformed. Sterling waved me over from his side of the fence one Saturday morning while I mowed my lawn. For his words, I turned off my mower. As I stood near the fence line, he asked, "Why does your fence extend so far back? Do you keep anything special behind it?" I was surprised by his curious, not accusatory tone. It was odd to question my fence's placement since it was on my property. I said, "Not really. I just wanted the whole yard enclosed when I moved in." He nodded, pursed his lips, and mumbled about his side yard being cramped. I dismissed it as a new neighbor's observation. I didn't realize it foreshadowed a bigger issue. One night a week after that conversation, my dog barked nonstop. He rarely barks and is well trained. It was nearly midnight when I checked the clock. I looked out the window, half expecting a raccoon in my trash cans. A faint glow appeared in the back corner of my property. I went to the backyard window after turning on the lights. The fence slats revealed flashlight-like flashes on the other side. I was curious but cautious. Who walks around a backyard at midnight behind a tall fence? I locked the house and checked my security camera feed from my living room because it was too late to chat. Despite their low resolution, the cameras show silhouettes and basic movements. I saw a figure with a flashlight creeping along the fence line on the other side. The grainy footage suggested Sterling, but I couldn't confirm. The next morning, I checked the fence and yard for damage and footprints, but found none. The world seemed normal. I assumed my neighbor enjoyed nighttime exploration. It seemed odd, but I forgot it. A few days later, I saw Sterling fiddling in his driveway as I headed to work. A fold-up ladder, gardening tools, and plywood leaned against his garage. When I reversed out, he gave me a strange look, but didn't wave. He glared at my fence before running back inside, looking tense. I had a strange feeling that this fence was a point of contention for him, but I couldn't explain why. I had permission to place it. Besides, it wasn't new construction that could have crossed property lines. For years, no neighbor had complained about it. After a few weeks, I heard from neighbors that Sterling had been complaining about the wooded area's difficulty access. Although not prime real estate, this wooded area behind our lots has a small path some neighbors walk on. This has never been a formal walkway, but rather a lightly used route for exercise or dog walking. On my side, the fence reaches the property line on a slight slope. Due to the yard's shape, Sterling has less room. People said he was muttering, "If only that fence wasn't so far over," to make a straight path from his yard to the wooded trail. Naturally, I never authorized him to remove or move my fence. I initially dismissed his complaints as idle chatter. I thought if he wanted direct trail access from his property, he would take a different route or buy the vacant lot next door. Apparently, he had other plans. Sterling was half parked on the curb in front of my driveway when I got home from work. It was strange because I have a clear property line and no one should park that far over. I saw him step out, look at me, and go back into his house without a greeting as I pulled in carefully to avoid hitting his car. He may have been frustrated about something else. I was still annoyed that he partially blocked my driveway. I knocked on his door out of neighborliness. "Hey, Sterling," I said when he opened it. "I don't know if you noticed, but your car is over my driveway. Could you move it?" He stood there silently, then grunted, "I'll move it later," and closed the door. That was his first direct hostility. Although annoyed, I didn't want to escalate, so I let it go for the evening and parked at an angle to avoid his car. I assumed he was having a bad day when it was gone the next morning. We never had a polite conversation again. Over the next few weeks, I noticed little signs that Sterling hated my fence. We found random scratches on the boards near the fence behind his garage. I once found a small pile of sticks and trash near my fence, as if someone was intentionally dumping waste on my side. I ignored it because I couldn't prove it was him and it was minor. I attributed it to wind or kids playing. But tension grew. One sunny afternoon changed everything. I was repairing a small fence patch near the back corner after taking a day off to run errands. I replaced a few rotted boards with new ones. Sterling came over and leaned on the fence by my side, watching me. Uneasy, I turned to him and asked, "Everything okay? You know, you could just move that fence back a few feet," he said irritably. "You'd still have more than enough yard," he said condescendingly, like he was helping me keep part of my yard. My calm but firm response was that I wouldn't move anything. The conversation heated up. He raged about needing better access to the wooded path for his renovation project. Something about bringing in materials without going around the block. I told him the fence was permanent, and his convenience was not my concern. We had heated words, but I never spoke above what was necessary. Sterling stormed out, slamming his back door. I realized then that he was fixated on this deep frustration. Though my heart was racing, I told myself I was fine. The chaos started early one morning. Morning came around 6 a.m. to walk my dog. Usually I went to the backyard, let the dog run, and came inside for coffee. Something was going on near the fence separating my front yard from Sterling's as I opened the back door. Probably something big hitting wood. At first I thought a big branch fell. Next came a second thud and the distinct sound of wood splitting. Alerted, I ran to the side of the house and saw Sterling's car partially inside my yard after ramming through the fence. I had planks everywhere after a huge section of my wooden barrier broke. Heart dropped. I rushed forward, shouting, "What? Are you okay?" He was in the driver's seat, engine running, glaring at me with anger and defiance. Dumbfounded, I shouted over the engine, "What happened?" He revved the car again as if to drive into my yard. Instantly, I shouted to stop. Good thing he did. We locked eyes for a moment, and I saw a strange expression that made me think he was almost proud of his actions. He backed up slowly, scraping broken wood along his vehicle as he exited my fence's gaping hole. I asked him if he was hurt or needed help, but he drove off, leaving splinters and tire tracks. I stood with my fence ruined and my property exposed with no explanation. My mind was confused and angry. Run inside and check the security camera footage. I wanted to document everything. The front camera, which faces the fence, caught Sterling as he lined up his car, put it in gear, and drove into it. No accidents or gas pedal slips were observed. It was intentional. The footage showed him stop briefly at the edge of his driveway to align the car, then accelerate. The force ripped several fence posts from the ground. It was strange to watch. Called police. They said an officer would take a report after I explained. I took photos of the damage from various angles as I walked around the property. Large fence sections were scattered, some broken into shards. His tires ripped up grass and dirt, a complete mess. Although I was no fence expert, I estimated the damage would cost thousands to repair or replace. I showed the officer the video. Incredulous, the officer raised his eyebrows. Was there a previous dispute with Sterling? I explained the fence argument, but the officer was still confused. "This is pretty blatant," he said. "We must speak to him immediately." We walked next door and the officer knocked on Sterling's door for 10 minutes without success. Sterling eventually opened it slightly. Even though he had just driven through my fence 30 minutes earlier, he looked disheveled like he had just woken up. Officer introduced himself and asked Sterling to explain. Sterling was barely opening the door when he shouted, "It was an accident," and tried closing it again. After some resistance, Sterling stepped onto his porch with arms folded after the officer insisted. He ignored me. The officer asked, "Why did you hit your neighbor's fence?" Sterling reiterated, "It was an accident. Slipped foot. It scared me, so I left to calm down." The officer cited the camera footage. Sterling stood with a frown, refusing to speak. The officer took my statement and Sterling's half statement and told us we'd be contacted for follow-up. I was so frustrated I had to leave before saying something stupid. I heard Sterling say I had no right to fence off that part of the property as I returned to my broken fence. The puzzle pieces fell into place. He didn't want my fence and had taken drastic, destructive measures to remove it. The next day, I called my insurance company and explained the situation. They advised me to file a claim. However, Sterling's insurance may be liable for damages since this was vandalism. I also called a local attorney to learn my rights. I knew Sterling was wrong legally. I owned the fence, had a permit, and had camera footage of his actions. My attorney advised me to file a police report, which I already had. Ask the city or county prosecutor to file charges if the police found enough evidence, which they did, and consider civil action if he refused to pay damages. Sterling behaved even stranger than I expected. He disappeared for a few days. His car was not in the driveway, his nighttime lights were off, and his house was empty. I thought he was avoiding conflict or staying with a friend to avoid questions. He left me to manage his chaos. My backyard was partially street accessible. I worried about my dog escaping or strangers entering my property. I moved temporary fencing panels around the damaged area, but it looked terrible and wasn't as secure. A local officer called me the third day after the fence incident to say Sterling had given a more detailed statement. Sterling said it was an accident, the officer said. The officer said Sterling claimed I was illegally blocking his access to the wooded area behind our properties to justify the damage. The officer was unconvinced, but he wanted me to verify my permits and property boundary documents. Thankfully, I did. I offered to show everything in person. I presented my property survey, original fence permit, and other paperwork at the station the next morning. The officer told me they had enough evidence to charge property destruction and would give the case to the district attorney. I felt relief that legal processes were underway, but worried about how long they would take. My ideal outcome is that Sterling pays for a new fence and learns about boundaries, both literal and metaphorical. But his mistake only began there, because once the footage circulated among neighbors, word travels fast, Sterling may have been tampering with other neighbors' properties. A family 2 doors down reported a suspicious mailbox dent that matched Sterling's bumper height. A neighbor across the street said they noticed new scratches on their car after a heated argument over a parking space. He always reacted pettily when upset. One neighbor revealed that they had overheard Sterling say he was untouchable because he had powerful friends in another city. I don't believe rumors, but he acted like he was above the law. That mindset was about to be tested. Because I filed charges over the fence and others told the police about possible property damage. A friend at the local finance office, I'd done some freelance work for them, told me Sterling's property taxes were seriously delinquent, which created an interesting subplot. I didn't want to get into anyone's finances, but if he was flipping or renovating the property to rent or sell, he might be broke. That may explain his desperation. His destructiveness was still unjustified. This delinquent tax information would become important. I contacted a reputable fencing company for repair estimates. I expected a large bill given the damage. If Sterling didn't pay, I'd sue civilly. I hoped insurance and his out-of-pocket payment would make me whole. Sterling's car pulled into his driveway for the first time in nearly a week the day after I got the repair quote. From my living room window, I watched him exit, look at the gaping hole in my fence, and shake his head like he'd been wronged. This guy had incredible nerve. I avoided direct engagement. All future communications would be official. 2 days later, Sterling's insurance company sent me a formal letter saying they'd received notice of the incident, but were investigating because Sterling claimed it was an accident. I sent them security camera footage. Naturally, the insurance adjuster called me to apologize for the situation after reviewing it. Her voice was agitated. Since the video showed it was intentional, I suspected Sterling was lying to her. She said they wouldn't cover deliberate vandalism because they don't cover that. She implied Sterling would pay for the fence himself. What I expected was that Sterling had shot himself in the foot by driving through my fence so obviously. The biggest blow to Sterling was yet to come. Remember those unpaid property taxes? The county learned of his repeated code violations and apparent disregard for other code issues like improper renovation debris disposal and sidewalk maintenance in front of his house. Neighborhood residents complained. The local authorities were interested, especially since a few people were banding together to push the city to condemn unsafe parts of his unfinished renovations. It was chaotic. Sterling soon faced a criminal case for destroying my fence, neighbor claims for property damage, and the county demanding unpaid taxes and code violations. Celine, a construction supply store employee, was my friend. She found me cheap fence materials. I planned to let the fencing company do most of the work, but I was ready to help if needed. Celine said it could take months in small claims court or higher courts. If it meant following the rules and getting paid, I was fine. A few days later, my door was unexpectedly knocked. It was Sterling. He looked nothing like his arrogant self. His disheveled face showed stress, and his voice shook with rage or desperation. I let him speak from outside because I didn't feel comfortable letting him into my house given our history. "Can we talk about this fence situation?" I crossed my arms and sighed. "Sure, but any agreement we make, I want it in writing, and I want you to pay for what you did." His eyes flickered nervously and he mumbled, "I don't have the money to fix the fence right now, but maybe we can work out a payment plan." I told him I was open to hearing him out, but needed assurance he wouldn't do something destructive again. I didn't believe his apology, despite his fine words. I suggested mediation for a payment plan if his attorney suggested it. Otherwise, I would pursue all legal options. He asked me to consider that he was having a hard time financially, and I said I'd tried to be a good neighbor before he drove through my fence. After leaving, no resolution was reached. I informed my attorney of Sterling's visit that day. She advised me not to sign anything without her approval. I concurred. From then on, I meticulously recorded every interaction with Sterling in case it was relevant in court. People in the neighborhood heard Sterling was trying to sell the half-renovated house to escape his problems. I thought he wanted to flee to avoid lawsuits, tax liens, and fees. I understood his desire to leave, but I wouldn't let him leave without fixing his damage. Next weeks were a roller coaster. Filed an official complaint to be part of property sale negotiations. My attorney said I could lien Sterling's property if he sold the house without settling the fence damages. That was our decision. We filed a property lien for the estimate-based fence repair cost. He would have to pay me from the house sale proceeds. Sterling learned about the lien quickly and was furious. He came knocking again, demanding I remove the lien, saying the fence wasn't worth that much, and that I had no right. I calmly reminded him of the camera footage, police report, and licensed fencing company estimate. His claim was that the price was inflated. I let him get quotes from reputable companies if he didn't believe me. I even offered to reduce the claim if he found a legitimate fencing contractor who was cheaper. My compromise ended there. As time went on, I noticed Sterling's property was being shown to buyers. They stopped, looked around, and sometimes glanced at my gaping fence. At least twice, I heard them asking him about it outside. He quickly called it a minor dispute that's being resolved. I liked that he downplayed it. The dispute had major legal implications. Harriet, a neighbor who has lived there for decades, told me that Sterling had planned to build a ramp or gate that would lead directly to the wooded area. He wanted to turn that small wooded path into a truck road. Harriet overheard him bragging about how he was going to bypass city permits by just rearranging my fence. The arrogance was mind-blowing, especially since there was no legal way to do what he wanted on someone else's property. Harriet didn't think he'd do this, but she saw the wreckage and realized he was desperate. Meanwhile, litigation continued. After finding evidence, the district attorney charged Sterling with misdemeanor property damage, which could be upgraded if more incidents occurred. Sterling's attorney sought a plea deal or settlement to avoid jail. Since it was property damage and no one was hurt, I expected steep fines and restitution, but not jail time. Restitution worried me because it could cover my fence, insurance premiums, and emotional distress. Sterling cornered. He had multiple code violations, a fence court date, rumors of neighbor claims, and a property tax debt. His property was becoming more trouble than it was worth. After a for sale sign went up one afternoon, a real estate agent began holding showings. I showed buyers that a large section of fence was missing. I wouldn't sabotage a sale, but Sterling couldn't hide the property's condition and legal issues. Buyers saw me working on my garden or cleaning up, and many politely asked, "Is something going on with the fence here?" I would honestly say that the homeowner's vehicle destroyed it, and it was being legally repaired. After weeks of negotiations, Sterling accepted an offer. A buyer from out of town planned to renovate and flip the house. I assumed that meant the buyer was unaware of the legal drama or ready to handle it. Unless Sterling paid for my fence repairs, my lien on the property would remain. A few days before closing, Sterling's attorney contacted my attorney to propose a settlement. Sterling would pay me the estimate to repair the fence plus a small sum to cover additional expenses if I removed the lien. I had no reason to refuse because that's all I wanted, to have my fence fixed properly and not pay for his recklessness. I accepted settlement. I used the payout to replace the damaged fence section, upgrade some older sections, and add a security feature to my camera system. I stopped taking chances. My attorney prepared the paperwork. Sterling sold his property after the lien was lifted and the money was in my account. He left soon after, his arrogance fading. I think he settled because he realized I had him in a corner and had proof of his wrongdoing. I never received a direct apology, but it wouldn't have changed much. That resolved the civil issue, but what about the criminal charge? It appears Sterling pleaded no contest to property damage in court. He received probation, community service, and restitution, which he had paid through the settlement. He also received a harsh lesson on respecting others' property from the judge. A few weekends later, neighbors saw him in a county-issued vest cleaning up trash on a highway. They couldn't resist sending pics. To say it didn't satisfy me would be a lie. I don't like celebrating others' failures, but Sterling caused this one. The new owner met me one afternoon while I was restaining my rebuilt fence after Sterling left. Emery was polite but reserved. I told him a brief, carefully worded fence story and hoped we could get along better as neighbors. Emery looked horrified and apologized for my ordeal, even though it wasn't his fault. He promised to inform me of any fence line property changes. I wanted nothing more. Sterling's final settlement partially covered the attorney's fees, so I didn't lose much money, besides the annoyance and time spent dealing with this. Protecting my property rights was my biggest win. I never kowtowed to bullies. It was a reminder that you have to fight for what you deserve. Strangely, this ordeal brought me closer to some of my neighbors. Even people who just nodded or waved stopped by to talk about Sterling. After he left, some of us had a barbecue to celebrate the neighborhood's peace. We all helped each other with small home improvement projects, restoring the sense of community I'd missed in suburban life. Sterling's audacity to climb into his car and drive at full speed into my fence still amazes me. I'll never delete camera footage. It shows that entitled or cornered by their own bad decisions, some people can be that irrational. Staying vigilant, knowing your rights, and never letting someone intimidate you into giving up your property was my biggest lesson. My fence was approved and documented. Sterling's legal evasion went disastrously wrong. The aftermath of the wooded area behind our houses is another subplot. Shortly after Sterling sold the house, the local parks department considered buying the land from an out-of-state private owner to turn it into a small nature reserve with trails. I and other neighbors supported the idea to prevent woods development. Ironically, Sterling wanted to exploit that area for his own benefit. Instead, the path behind my yard was considered for public improvement after everything settled. Emery, the new owner, was open to a well-maintained public trail behind our lots, but I insisted that the fence remain intact and that any official trail be on the other side of the property line. I stressed my fence and privacy values. The project is still in discussion, but it's already more community-focused than Sterling expected. Sterling's meltdown inspired neighbors and friends to be cautious. People asked, "Did you hear about the mad guy who drove through a fence?" It would start a conversation about property lines, communication, and the ridiculous lengths some people go to when they don't get their way. Reliving the story for the umpteenth time was exasperating, but it gave me a reputation in the neighborhood as the person who stood their ground and wouldn't let intimidation tactics fly. I was grateful for my security cameras, which provided crucial evidence, my attorney, who navigated the legal system smoothly, and my supportive neighbors, who rallied around me when they realized Sterling's outrage targeted me. It was stressful, but Sterling realized he had no defense for his actions, and everything fell into place. If he had politely asked me months earlier or tried to negotiate a non-property damage agreement, we might have found a solution, but ramming his car into my fence was so irrational that the community and courtroom had no sympathy for him. After the fence was rebuilt and the dust settled, I took a short trip with close friends to clear my head. Ironically, we hiked in a national forest on well-maintained trails. Everything Sterling foolishly thought he could avoid by removing my fence. I felt relieved on that hike. My property was safe again, the legal issues were being resolved, and I had survived this bizarre confrontation with dignity. The camera footage and photos of my fence's destruction are still in my cloud storage, and I printed them. They remind me that I have the right to defend my property and that those who destroy it will pay. To deter future fence rammers, I've added yard lighting. That may sound paranoid, but this experience teaches you not to underestimate how far someone will go when upset about something they think they deserve. The final poetic justice came when county offices announced property tax delinquencies. Sterling was listed for the old address, and if the sale failed, the county may have started foreclosure proceedings. The end of his misguided sense of invincibility was fitting, even though I don't celebrate financial misfortunes. He called someone untouchable, but the system worked out. You'll pay for breaking the law or destroying property. Things are much calmer here. Emery is a considerate neighbor. The code violations on Sterling's former house are being fixed, and it may soon be a lovely home for someone else. Our fence is stronger and newer than ever, so my dog can roam safely. The neighborhood is peaceful, as expected. Someone occasionally asks, "Are you worried something like this might happen again?" I always say, if someone is deranged enough to try, they'll find themselves in deeper trouble than Sterling did. I document everything and use resources to protect myself. That's my best advice for anyone with a crazed neighbor. Stay calm, gather evidence, follow the law, and don't let someone bully you off your property. Sterling hasn't been mentioned in months. He reportedly moved to another state to start over, according to the grapevine. Hopefully he learned that terrorizing neighbors isn't the best way to live. My chapter ended when I fixed that fence and cleared that settlement check, but the story may live on in local lore for years. At times, I'm amazed and amused by the whole thing. Not often do you wake up to your neighbor's car through your fence. In my youth, I never imagined dealing with something this outrageous, let alone photographing it. I'm still here, fence intact, lesson learned, and better prepared. I hope that's a positive. Every conflict, no matter how bizarre, can teach you about stand up for yourself and appreciate simple things like a sturdy wooden fence and neighbors who respect your boundaries. For anyone who's read this far, I hope you never have to deal with a neighbor who vandalizes cars. Remember this story if you do. As crazy and stressful as it can get, there are systems to help you, and with persistence and faith in the facts, you'll win. If someone suggests you remove your fence for their convenience, remind them what happened to Sterling. He only hurt himself with his big mistake. Friends, thank you. See you soon.